Thank you very much, Daniel, for that introduction. It's a joy to be here, and I thank Father Mariusz for being the occasion for my first visit to Blackfriars since taking up the position, and I hope it will be the first of many. This week I'm beginning a reading group with students in the university, Sir Talange's The Intellectual Life, a very great Dominican, where he talks about the importance of sleep and posture and fresh air and that kind of thing. So it was wonderfully Dominican to find that, here I am preparing to give my talk, and that they'd even laid on a banana for me. And this is, real consideration for body as well as soul. So thank you very much. I want to begin by saying how grateful I am to Father Mariusz for this book and for the many years of scholarship that it represents. And I particularly want to pay tribute to the breadth of his reading, that he combines historical scholarship of this question in a long history of Thomism alongside being a creative, contemporary, constructive Thomist theologian. So I've tried to do a little bit of the latter in writing on evolution, but I just don't have anything of the long history of the discussion at my fingertips, and the fact that you do to such a degree is really impressive. I loved your work on the Augustinian heritage and the rational seeds. It's so important that we remember that evolution today also is not like it was 50 years ago. We're living through one of the fastest moving periods of development in evolutionary thought with the extended evolutionary synthesis, and I'm really glad that you've brought people here today who can address that we're not sort of fighting battles or engaging with evolution of a previous age. So my main response is simply to say that I'd like to read more of this, and we can at least be rather glad on that front that you're so young, and we can look forward to many more books. If my talk is rather skewed towards points of contention, then I do offer it as someone who finds your work really among the very best of the contemporary interlocutors one can have on this topic. It falls to me to discuss the book on questions of the origin and nature of human beings. And I want to begin by saying that the Roman Catholic tradition suggests perhaps three important parts of a framework within which one would want to think about evolution and the human being. So one is the idea that some functions of the soul have no bodily dimension to them, and on account of that, it's taken to imply a sort of non-natural origin of the human soul. Secondly, the idea of original righteousness, that human beings were granted at the beginning this gift of grace beyond nature, that they could have preserved themselves or been preserved in a state of righteousness, which was then lost. And of course, also the idea of inherited original sin assumed to be from an original pair. So we've got those three assumptions, those three framing convictions. And I should say that not everybody will share them. I think many scientists engaging with this book won't, and indeed not every Christian would share all of them in exactly the same respect. So perhaps some of what then follows might seem a little bit odd to some people, rather baroque, that one has to sort of come up with these different accounts of species, for instance, in order to navigate the tradition. I don't think I share all of those convictions absolutely, but I'm not so naive as to think that we don't all have convictions that structure our thought. And I think one of the greatnesses of the Catholic tradition is that it's clear about them and they're on the table. So I think everybody has to work within a set of presuppositions, and we see that on display here. And if I don't necessarily share all of them, then whenever I differ from them, so for instance over whether there could be a natural origin of the human soul, I always go out of my way to say, but the Catholic Church, which is venerable and much to be respected, thinks differently. So we've got those three convictions, but in fact, Father Mariusz begins with the Bible and with an argument, we might say, for holism. So this is as much informing his philosophical convictions as any scientific ones. He begins with the idea that the scriptures point us away from a dualism, and that the human being is not some strange amalgam of soul and body, but one hylomorphic unity. And if in some ways the philosophy gives him things that he's got to navigate or negotiate in the book, it can also be a cause of real clarity. And I think this is a really good example of that. So he even takes his own tradition to task for speaking too loosely about the human being as a union of body and soul, because there just isn't a body separate from the form that forms it. There's no, other than after death, no form that isn't connected to the body. So he's quite distinct here from the sort of Bonaventurian school of hylomorphism, which sees the body as having its own form and the soul as having its own matter. And I think this is very much the kind of hylomorphism that one should embrace. So I stand on the side by side with the Dominicans, not least because I think this hylomorphic vision allows us to avoid both monism and dualism and to actually have the best of both worlds. And of course, it also relates and can do really productive work with the relation of wholes and parts and with questions of emergence. And it's perhaps no surprise that Father Mariusz is also a real leader in thinking about emergence rather, from a philosophical perspective. So as I say, it's a very philosophically driven account, theologically driven account, but it does really help him to speak clearly about all sorts of issues. So the scientific parameters, there'll be no surprise to you. The idea that we are descended from earlier hominids, that this is a history of descent with modification and natural selection, just like any other that characterizes evolution. These are the scientific assumptions. And that we are descended from a population. The link is of population to population, never going through just a single pair. So, and then when it comes to the human being, from the Thomist side, the assumptions are that God is the direct cause of each human soul. So not just of the first human beings and the origin of the species, but the direct cause of each human soul, which is not adduced or drawn out from the potential of matter, unlike the coming to be of any other organism. So the 3 points I want to discuss are actually the generation of every organism, so not even just, even before we get to questions of species, every cat having kittens, every dog having puppies, then onto the speciation, and then onto the arrival of the human being. And if that looks a little bit like I'm here under false pretenses, because I'm only at the end going to come round to the human being, it's because I do think the book as a whole is very integrated, and the account of the human being rests upon an account of speciation, and then what's perhaps even more unexpected but integrated, the account of speciation rests on an account of the origin of individual organisms. And I really want to stress that if what comes is a bit boat rocking, then it's partly because I think we're here to have a conversation and take things on, and I do it in a spirit of respect and admiration. Father Tabaczek stresses God's role in the drawing forth of every new organism. And this is important because that means that speciation is perhaps not so different in kind from the origin of individuals. And I wonder here if there is a danger of mixing the natural with the miraculous. I think his claim is that, of course, being as such, and essence as such, are things that we can't create. And of course, I completely agree with that. Whenever there is an arrival of being or essence, that must come from God. But I think what my suggestion would be that we can make something of the fact that Aquinas is such an extraordinarily good Aristotelian and such an extraordinarily good Platonist. And I think I'd rather put the Platonism in place first, relating the world to, in every respect and every power and everything about everything coming from God. And I think once that's in place, one can then turn to the Aristotelianism and not need it to do the work of keep reminding us about God. I think that there is a sort of Platonic, participatory founding of all things by the gift of God, which is kind of rapturous and tends to give itself to really lavish and enthusiastic language, so that God then is already presupposed in all that's said about creatures and creation. And then, turning to Aristotle, one can concentrate on the integrity, intelligibility, and the logic that God has bestowed upon things. It might have been Fran O'Rourke who said that the greatness of Aquinas was that he's a Platonist in sweep and an Aristotelian in detail, which is, and if you imagine it the other way around, we'd be in rather a mess. So I do wonder whether, by integrating this point about God into the picture of the arrival of organisms, this doesn't introduce a sort of like a glitch in the matrix, or a gap, a kind of hook within generation that opens the way for speciation itself to be some kind of jump or interruption, where I'd rather say all the Platonist things first and then have a bit more of a seamless Aristotelian picture of how the unfolding of the world works. So when it comes to speciation, I think I want to... So that what I've just said might sound like a footnote, an aside, but I think it matters for the account of speciation because if there's something excessive beyond the capacity of creatures as such in the generation of every new organism, then that can ground the idea that there is something excessive in the arrival of each new kind of specific form. And here, mainly I've got questions rather than contentions, but is the arrival of a species a completely natural process, obviously given by God, or is the way in which the arrival of a species involves some sort of exceptional part on God's work on God's part? It's described as instrumental. We've had this discussed already from Professor Paul, which involves things being used to do more than they can do. I note, by the way, that this whole idea about seeds and gametes and things in the scholastic tradition, they use the language of instrument. Suarez has a great discussion of this. But they are instruments not primarily of God there, of course everything's an instrument of God, but the gametes are the instrument of the originating species. So I just thought about that a few minutes ago, but I think that's an interesting connection here. So I'm really interested in what's going on in the final transition when we've got this lineage. Is the only difference at this point a transition of metaphysical species, or is the idea that there's a sort of pent-up spring of accumulating biological changes which suddenly jumps into a biological change that really does look empirically different? And I think here, actually, metaphysical species and biological species are being somewhat decoupled. So the different moments in the transition and the last moment that gets us into a new species are more or less the same in kind from a biological perspective, but we have this jump in metaphysical species. And I have to say, this makes me a bit uneasy because I think that metaphysics and the empirical align. I think it's part of being confident in metaphysics that you think it really latches onto the reality of things. So to put this another way, I'm worried about what sort of enterprise this is. I think it actually seems a little bit too modest, and I think we could go further. I think it may be in danger of saving the appearances. So I think there's an admirable Catholic tradition of working with a genuinely open heart towards what we can know of reality, and thinking that our categories really map onto the reality of things. That Thomism is metaphysically and epistemologically realist. And that, so epistemologically, what do I mean by that? To know something is to let it impinge upon you and to let the form of the thing inform you. And obviously in the mode of receive it in the mental mode. So I'm worried that if we let metaphysical and biological species get separate from one another, then what is this thing that's the cause of my knowledge? It seems like it's the biological species, because that's the thing that we're encountering empirically. But as a realist, I want to say the thing that is impinging upon me and forming my knowledge is the thing itself. And if metaphysical species floats free of that, then I'm a bit concerned. So I was thinking about this as I was walking in this morning, and I think this tension between a commitment to metaphysical realism and to epistemological realism is quite a good way of looking at this. So my diagnosis is that out of a desire to preserve metaphysical realism, one's letting the epistemological realism go. So epistemological realists are allergic to nominalism. They don't like the idea that species are fuzzy entities. They don't like the idea that there isn't something truly common to all examples of the same kind. And therefore, in order to preserve this metaphysical realism, you have these perhaps arbitrary jumps between species. But I think that is right. So maybe it preserves your metaphysical realism, but at what cost to our epistemological realism? Which becomes the empirical and the metaphysical becomes unmoored from one another. So I think there's a loss in terms of epistemological realism, and I think there's a loss in terms of the kind of project that one is involved with, which I think should be to try to, as much as possible, to take the science for what it is. And if what it's presenting us with is an account of species that are fuzzy, both geographically and over time, then I think we should have a go at formulating that metaphysically, rather than what I think could be a sort of like epicycles in the account of the movement of the heavens. So there are two passages where Aquinas talks about this. I'll read a couple of them out. So he says, there are certain anomalies, that's to say irregularities, that appear in the motion of the planets, because the planets seem sometimes swifter, now slower, now stationary, now regressing. But he takes it that this isn't appropriate for heavenly motions because things ought to move at a steady speed. So the way to save this, and he gives us a pretty impressive bit of intellectual history here, is the idea that they are moving at a constant speed, but against the gross movement in the sky, there are these cycles that they undergo. And if you combine the two things, little cycles, then you save the appearances. And there's another, so that's from the commentary on Aristotle's On the Heavens. In the Summa Theologiae, Part 1, Question 32, Article 1, response to the second objection, he says, there are two ways in which we can know something, and there's one way where we're really certain about it, and on this front we know that the planets must have a constant motion. And there's another way, let me quote this directly, in contrast, the theory of eccentrics and epicycles is considered as established only in the sense that the sensible appearances of the heavenly motions can be explained, that saves the appearances, not therefore as if this proof were sufficient for as much as some other theory might explain them. So Aquinas is clearly committed to the idea that, I don't want to mention the name of Occam in these august walls, but there's something here that we shouldn't multiply entities and postulates needlessly. And I don't think I'm ventriloquizing Aquinas in an irresponsible way to say, if we were to present him with an account by which heavenly bodies could have a uniform motion without having to add the extra complication, he would prefer that, because it's just, you say only the thing you're sure of rather than having to say the other thing, which is only there for the sake of saving the appearances. For the sake of scientific precision, I should say, in fact, heavenly bodies don't move with a regular speed. They trace out the line between the star and the planet, traces out the same area in unit time, but that means that when they are closer to the planet, they move faster, and when they're further away, in the sun, and when they're further away, they move more slowly. But there is a uniformity, but it's not actually a uniformity of velocity. So my instinct is to keep as close as possible to the science and just let it be a problem to us, like grit in an oyster. And I wrote a paper a few years ago trying to think about evolution from a Thomist perspective as a Platonist, saying, how can Aquinas' Platonism cope with these more fuzzy sense of species? And in meaning this in the nicest sense, I think one could give the Aristotelianism more of a run for its money to see whether it can cope with what the science presents us with, rather than saying behind the biological fluidity is this step change in a metaphysical species that's kind of inaccessible to us. But I would be very happy to be challenged on that. I've had conversations with Daniel about the idea that the soul has that there are things that have there's no organ for certain aspects of the work of the soul, like, I suppose, abstraction of universals is one, is it?
Intellectual activity, rationality. Yeah.
And one of the things that worries me about that is that it becomes completely like Teflon to any sort of scientific investigation. And this is actually Aquinas' greatness, is that he recognises that all sorts of things do have bodily organs behind them, like memory and the senses and the integration of senses. And is that integration of senses too has a bodily organ? So most of the accusations against Aquinas on this front are just rubbish. I mean, he really does take the bodiliness of human thought extremely seriously. One of the things you can do with that is you can say, aha, well, it looks like this person with Alzheimer's disease, or maybe that's a bad example because it's about memory, but this person with a certain physical impediment, it looks like it's affected their soul, but actually it hasn't affected their soul. It's just affected the means by which we have any access to the soul, or the mean by which their soul has access to reality. But at the risk of being Popperian in a way that I'm not very often, this seems sort of unprovable. And that worry, I'd rather people made even outrageous claims that had some kind of scientific tractability than that there should be claims that just are intractable to any kind of scientific explanation. Because I honestly think that the Aristotelian Thomistic picture is true, and that we really are getting at the truth of things, and the idea that you're then making true claims that don't have this verifiability worry me. And just as I am worried about that with respect to the powers of the human soul, I'm also worried about them in terms of what's going on in evolution in these two different kinds of species. Okay, how am I doing for time? Forgot about a quarter of an hour, 20 minutes? Okay, so let's move to the third thing, the account of the transition to the human. I think the account of the origin of the human being builds on accounts of speciation more generally, which, as we've seen, rests on an account of generation more widely. But at this point, there's even less a sense of nature doing its natural thing. I do want to take time to say that I really do respect the way in which Father Tabaczek still keeps the discussion within the bounds of nature as much as possible. So there's a lovely discussion, for instance, about saying there is no body into which a soul is infused because you don't have a body unless you have a soul. But actually, on the origin of the human being as a species and of each human being, I'm not sure there's that much to argue about because it's so determined by one's prior commitments. So either you believe that the specific form of every human being is created directly by God outside of the natural order, or you don't. And like I've just said about evolution, I kind of want to reserve my judgment and say it is perfectly possible that that's the answer, but I'd like to give the neuroscientists, a run for their money and see what might be said about there being a natural origin of the human soul. Okay, so I'll come back to that. Our author seeks to allow, however, as much room for argument on this. Where there's room for argument, he really does try to keep the room for the argument open, and I think that's a really commendable part of the book. So particularly over the question of the relation of modern human beings to the first human beings and what that population looked like. I think there's some really interesting questions about what it means for there to be a suitability to this transition, theologically speaking. And I may be misremembering here what's his actual discussion and what's the authors that he's dealing with. But there is some discussion about whether the transition to the human being really involves no biological difference at all. Is that what we mean by it being a suitable addition? So you talk about it not being a voluntaristic, arbitrary, God just happens at this moment to put in to have there be a body that has this soul. There's a sense that it's an appropriate preparation. And I just think it's interesting to discuss this from two different angles. So it's one thing to say, if you are operating on this view of things, when the soul is given, it's given to an appropriate, it falls in a lineage by which the body that lineage is offering up is an appropriate one. I don't think that means that it becomes appropriate for God to affect this particular kind of change. If God affects the change, then the preparation is an appropriate one. That doesn't mean that the hominid having arrived, it becomes required or demanded or for God to do that act. I remember talking to Thomas Joseph White about this, and he said, well, the precursor to the human being might be the most advanced animal we can imagine, and much more advanced than anything that we know outside of the modern humanity, but there still would be an empirical jump with the arrival of the first human being, simply because it would just have all sorts of capacities that the previous creature didn't have. And I think there's a really interesting set of questions there to be asked about maybe the human soul does all of the same job of informing the body that the previous hominid soul would have done. It just has these extra capacities. Not that I particularly necessarily want to endorse that. So the only time I've ever been asked to speak at the Angelicum was on this very topic. Thomas Joseph invited me to speak on, it was a conference on the soul, and I said, there's a sort of irony, Daniel was there as well, that here I am, I normally think there's not the width of a piece of paper between me and Thomism, and you've asked me to speak on here I am in the mothership of Thomism, and you've asked me to speak on one of the few questions where I'm just not completely convinced by him. I have a PhD student working on this sort of thing, and there's an extraordinary passage by Augustine where he says, the origin of the human soul is a more difficult question than either the creation of the world or God as Trinity or something like that. So at least we can all admit that we're on very difficult territory. And I should also say that I think that there is something maybe a little bit different here from evolution, because I take it that the evidence for evolution and a sense of how it works is pretty incontestable, or at least extremely strong. It's not like the neuroscientists are presenting us with a picture of how consciousness emerges, and they can just say, well, there you are, do better than that. I think there is something at the moment unexplored about it, unresolved, which raises for me actually a question about what kind of project are we all involved with, which I'll come to in a minute. But I do want to confess that it's possible that there is something just absolutely extraordinary about the human being, about each of you in front of me, and that we've been kind of bewitched by a certain kind of scientific naturalism by which we're ignoring the thing that's staring us in the face. So if I had to come down either side of either saying human beings are no great shakes, you're just animals like everything else, or taking the Roman Catholic perspective, I think empirically there'd be a lot to be said for taking the latter. I'd like to see whether there's a way that doesn't involve having to talk about the soul being human soul being a different kind of entity, but David Bentley Hart says somewhere, there are some propositions that are so ridiculous that only an idiot or a neuroscientist could believe them, which is, of course, characteristically caustic of him. And given that our wonderful Vice-Chancellor is a neuroscientist, she's an object lesson of how one doesn't need to be rude to neuroscientists. But I certainly don't want, in exploring the possibility that there could be a natural origin of the human soul, to be on the deflationary side of that. So let me come around to asking, what kind of project are we involved in? What kind of theological constraints, or in fact other kinds of constraints, might be at play? So I think that the project of this book is partly one of showing that a Thomistic account could possibly be offered for evolution. So I think that it's significant that some of the people that it's directed to are the Catholic equivalent of sort of fundamentalists. I mean, people who don't accept the science and are just not willing to engage with it. And so I think that, you know, the diagram that we've seen with the lineages and everything else, maybe one way of interpreting that is to say it's offering the case, making the case that it would be possible to have an account of evolution from a Thomist perspective. But I actually think that's too reactive. Now, I'm not involved in this discussion. It's the same with Father Austriaco's first book. When I read it, I thought, okay, it's good as telling us all the openings that there are in Aquinas towards evolution, but it's not doing very much constructive work. But then I came to realise that actually its job was to show Catholics who didn't, actually evangelical converts to Catholicism who don't accept evolution, that there's more in Aquinas than they might give him credit for. And I think here, perhaps, there's a kind of framing of the project which is showing that some possible Thomist account could be given of evolution with these naysayers in mind. But I just think the work's too important and too interesting and has too much going for it to be happy with a kind of reactive perspective. And I think there's a danger when one is addressing a particular kind of perspective that one can become completely unwittingly somewhat tethered to it because it frames the kind of conversation that you're having. But then, I mean, I'm really glad that people are arguing with Catholics who don't agree with evolution, but I wonder whether it clips the wings of the project a little bit. But then I should recognise that I have my own motivations for taking a let's see whether science can lead us sort of perspective, which are not all entirely to do with they're not necessarily intellectual ones. It could be that I enjoy having conversations with scientists. I'm really glad that I get the opportunity as a Christian theologian to be involved in projects with scientists. And there's a somewhat sort of psychological or sociological pressure on me to want to try and close the gap. So if I'm maybe diagnosing a psychological or ecclesial sociological reason why the book is engaging a particular audience, I have to recognise in myself that I have my own drives for wanting to seem as plausible as possible to scientists. But I do generally worry about the God of the gaps sort of danger, not just because of the idea that you're apologetically, as it were, and I'm not completely saying that's the case with this book, but saying, well, I'm pointing towards God because this can't do the work. But I also think there's something really positive about saying, isn't the world amazing that in itself it has these capacities? Okay, so just to end with considerations about human beings right at their origin. There's the question about original righteousness. It raises some interesting questions about creatures that have it, interbreeding with creatures that don't, and raises interesting questions about consent and that sort of thing. I take it that actually the Christian tradition doesn't present it with much of a problem here because human beings were stupid and almost immediately we came into existence however we did, and we had this gift of grace. We blew it. So I don't think there were human beings in a state of original righteousness hanging around on the scene for very long, having the chance to interbreed with anything else. I should say that I think that the idea of original righteousness is a very interesting one, partly because it allows Aquinas to take completely seriously that we are animals and material with all the propensities that would lead towards fragility and lust and violence and so on. It allows him to take our animality completely seriously and say we are responsible for our sin because we have the capacity not to sin. Then this question about polygenism and the state of the original community that we come from. I found this really excellent passage in the book, and I will be quoting it for scientists. Some really useful clarity. So there's a fourfold taxonomy between polyphyletic, if that's the right way of, and monophyletic, which is about do we descend from several races or one race? and then mono and polygenism, which is, do we descend from many individuals or from one individual or two? And I have never really had that discussion teased out so clearly before, and I think it's very helpful. Christianity has a relatively, or some parts of Christianity, especially the Catholic form, has a very good history of seizing upon what has been called monogenism in an anti-racist perspective. So there are people who took to Darwin because he's saying all human beings have a common origin. And so I've been a bit sort of rah for monogenism. This tells us very important things about the human being. I think the book has helped me to see that actually that's about monophyletism, that there is only one race, as it were, or from which modern humans descend. So, I mean, good for us for espousing monophyletism, but then we've still got the question of the mono and polygenetic difference. And I just want to commend the book for instance, as I say, making the most of the space that's left to Catholics on this point. And I really liked the discussion of archival work, people pouring away in the Vatican archives, finding different drafts of encyclicals and later encyclicals that weren't issued and that sort of thing. I think that's really fascinating. The science indicates a polygenetic, monophyletic origin. The present-day humanity is derived from a sizable group of interbreeding human beings. I mean, quite small if it got down to 7,000, but still more than 2. And there's a fascinating discussion of the pros and cons of these different perspectives. I particularly liked the way in which the Bible itself doesn't necessarily point us towards monogenism, because after all, where do Adam and Eve's sons get their wives from? You're not very far down the story, and there are all these cities around the place that seem to be threatening. So that's pretty impressive. And the question about interbreeding, though, does raise one question, which brings us back to the very beginning of my discussion, because I think it does all keep coming back to the very beginning, or else the middle part, which is about speciation. If you have these jumps in metaphysical species, so 2 individuals of species 1 produce an organism of metaphysical species 2, if that then interbreeds with a species, metaphysical species 1, what determines what kind of species the progeny is? Do you take your species from your mother and your father is not a facetious question. We could think about Bishop Wilberforce. Do you descend from an ape on your mother's side or your father's side? Do you descend from species 1 on your mother's side or your father's side? But I think it's to that question of what kind of project this is that is almost the hardest thing for me. I feel like it's the most challenging thing that I'm saying, but I do want to say it, which is that I think there are aspects of modern biology which can cause the Thomist, the Aristotelian, to have a real spring in her step. There are things about modern biology where we can say, yeah, this is home territory. We've got brilliant resources to address this. Finally, you're waking up after a century of reductionism to a picture where hylomorphism has quite a lot to offer. But like Job, should we not from the Lord's hand accept ill as well as good? And I think there are other aspects about modern biology that pose really gritty metaphysical questions, and I think we should try and let our Aristotelianism deal with biological species without making recourse to metaphysical species. Thank you very much.